Hi folks, my name's Jan Carson. I am a writer based here in East Belfast, and I'm really delighted to be spending a wee bit of time with you over the next few weeks with these writing sessions. First of all, I'm going to have you for about 20 minutes today, so grab a cuppa, you get your notepad ready, and let's get going. What we're going to cover in this first session is writing a folk tale together. I know that this project is looking particularly at folk stories, folk tales, myths, legends, and we're going to be focusing on writing a folktale in this session. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a few just very broad tips about writing, because I know some of you are quite new to this. So I've got 5 tips I'm going to show you that really help me. Number 1, if you're serious about writing, you need to do it every day. You need to put your bum in the seat, turn up, and wait for the words to come. If you're not in your seat, at your laptop or with your notepad, getting ready to write, you're not going to write anything. So turn up every day. Secondly, learn what sort of writer you are. You might be a morning writer or better in the evenings. You might be better on a laptop or a notepad. You might, like me, need an enormous mug of coffee to get going. You might need to write in a quiet place or in a cafe. Find out what kind of a writer you are and stick to that routine. Find what works for you. Third, big one for me, get over your own perfectionism. The very first thing that you write is going to be a bit rubbish. A lot of the first things I wrote were rubbish. You just need to get going, get past the fear of that blank page, and get something down, because my 4th point is edit. All the hard work of being a writer happens in the edit, when you start to take your notes and your ideas and play around with them and tone them up and take out the stuff that's drivel and dross and fix your grammar and read aloud to hear how it sounds and whether the story's coming through. The really hard work happens in the edit. So draft, edit. 5, learn from what you're reading. You can see I've got my books behind me. I am a ferocious reader. I read all the time, and I like to read to learn. So I read with a notepad in my hand and a pen. And I take notes on things that are working, things that aren't working in the story, ideas that I might want to sort of steal from another writer and play around with. Use your reading time to be constructive. If you're serious about being a writer, you need to be reading a lot. Not just the sort of stuff you want to write, but read widely, lots of different things in different genres. So next session I'll give you 5 more little helpful tips, but I hope those are good things to get you thinking and get you started. First of all, today I wanted to tell you what kind of a writer I am. I am a magic realist, and you may have heard that term, you may not have heard it before. It's basically what it says in the tin. A little bit of magic, strange things happen, but it's always grounded in the real world. The tradition comes mostly from Latin America and Eastern Europe, where writers like Günter Grass and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Salman Rushdie, who's one of my heroes, quite often couldn't say what they wanted to say because of oppression or getting into trouble with politics or the government or the law, and so they created these allegories and strange things that allowed them to use metaphor to talk about what they wanted to talk about, and that's going to be really important for what we're talking about today in writing a folk tale. I love to read magic realism, all of the classics that I've mentioned, and I also wanted to give you a few pointers if you're into exploring this genre. A brilliant Irish magic realist, Roisin O'Donnell. This is her first short story collection. And 2 of my favourite contemporary American magic realists, Amy Bender, who I absolutely love and very graciously gave me a quote from my last book, and Karen Russell, who I just think is a phenomenal writer, and I think she has 4 or 5 books out now. So explore magic realism. Why do I write magic realism? I write magic realism which is set in Northern Ireland because I want to embrace that social commentary aspect of it, which I was talking about with Marquez and Günter Grass. There are things in Northern Ireland that it is very difficult to talk about straight up, but using allegory and metaphor, I'm able to explore the politics and the culture. I also write magic realism because I feel that our reality is charged with the potential for wonder and the fantastical, and quite often in Northern Ireland we don't see the world outside our front door as something that is even worthy of exploration, but certainly not wonderful and strange and filled with the miraculous and beauty and all those things. So whenever I inject a little bit of magic into stories set in East Belfast, I like to think it's helping people to see that their community and their culture has the potential for wonder as well. I often borrow from traditional myths whenever I'm writing my stories. I like to play around and maybe take an aspect of something that I've borrowed from an Irish folk story or Greek mythology and place it in a realistic setting. If you're thinking about doing this, I've got a few tips for this as well. Your version has to bring something else to the table. Otherwise, why are you telling the story again? It's possibly already been told in the Iliad or in Grimm's Tales or in the Bible or wherever. Your version has to bring something new to the table. It has to come from a different angle, be told in someone else's voice, or open up something that we haven't thought about before. And there are lots of great examples of people who've done this. One of my favourite is Angela Carter, who takes a lot of the fairy tales and gives a feminist twist to them. So The Bloody Chamber is brilliant. It's quite violent, but it's really, really good as well. So you need to be bringing something else to the table when you tell this story. Second thing, you need to remember that the realistic has to be as believable as the fantastical. What do I mean by this? I mean that your characters have to be believable and lifelike and the sort of thing that your readers are going to invest in. Otherwise, they're not going to believe when strange things happen to them. So if I'm telling you a story about a kid that starts to fly, you have to first of all believe that they're a child before you'll enter into the belief that they're capable of flying. You can do this in all sorts of ways, by adding detail, by good description, by going deep into the characters of the people you're talking about, but the realistic has to be as believable as the fantastical element. If you're writing fantasy, that is why fantasy writers like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and all those guys spent so much time in their world building. Narnia had to be a believable world for us to enter into it and actually believe him and go with C.S. Lewis when he told us that the animals could talk and these strange things were happening. So invest a lot in the realistic, or you're going to lose your readers. Another tip for folks who are starting to write this kind of way for the first time: don't try to tell everything. There can be a desire to put all the details, every element, everyone's perspective into a story, and you need to be focused, especially when you're working in the short story format. The way I like to explain this is, if you've ever been to an art gallery and seen one of those enormous pictures of, the Houses of Parliament or everyone at a battle or a Victorian ball or whatever, where there's lots of people in the picture. Think of it like that. And think of it like you're putting a little frame around one section of the painting. So you're going to put a section cordoned off, and you're going to tell us what happens in that section. And it's the same when you're telling a story. You're not going to be able to tell the entirety of somebody's life in a 3,000 word short story. You can tell a moment, you can tell a perspective, you can tell a little framed section. So if you think about that, it stops it being intimidating, for one thing. You're only trying to tell a small amount of the story, not everything. So, few tips. Practically, how are you going to do this? Some of you might be a bit terrified right now because you've never written anything before. First of all, it's not like maths. There's no way to get this wrong. It's all about having fun and exploring things. I'm going to take you very, very slowly and simply through a little structure to write a story, and particularly to write a myth. Whenever writers come to a story, a lot of people think it's the plot that comes first. What happens? Actually, it's the character. You need to get underneath the skin of your characters, really, really get to know them. And then you put them into a situation, and that's what generates the plot. So we have a wee formula. Character plus situation equals plot. What do I mean by that? Well, I want you to think about someone that you know really, really well. It could be your partner, it could be a sibling, it could be a parent. And I want you, it's a bit cruel, but I want you to put that person on the deck of the Titanic as it's sinking. Now, if I told you there was only one boat left, only one space in that boat, you could probably tell me how that person that you know really well will react to that situation. Will they elbow everyone else out of the way to get that last spot? Will they let everybody else take it before them? Will they break down and cry and go hysterical? You can tell me that because that person is a real person to you. You know how they react in a difficult situation. You know what makes them laugh. You know what makes them angry. And so you can tell me how they will react when you put them absolutely anywhere. It's the same with characters. You'll hear writers saying that the character told me to do this. I didn't write it. The character told me to write it. And that's what they're talking about. They've gotten to know their characters so well that they just plunk them down in a situation and the character almost tells them what to do, how they would react. You need to ask big questions of your characters to get to know them if you want to do this. I've got behind me here, this is my box of tricks. My grandmother left me this big box of photographs when she passed away, and it's full of fantastic images of people that she knew. And I sometimes use these people for characters when I'm a bit stuck, but you can do it with anyone. Could be yourself, could be a person you know, or it could be a fictional person from a myth that you want to retell. To get under their skin, very quickly ask them 4 questions. What is your character's biggest fear? What is their biggest hope? What is their greatest asset, the thing that's best about them? And what's their biggest weakness? You can do that super quickly, jot down the answers, and that will actually give you insight into all of the meaty stuff that's going on below the surface of your character. What drives them, what motivates them, what they're afraid of. You get a little snapshot of that. Once you've done that, you put your character into a situation. And we're talking about rewriting myths today. So you could take your character and you could put them into a Celtic myth that you're familiar with, plunk them down at a battle, set them in a spot where they're having to face off with a giant, or climb a mountain, or whatever you fancy. You can equally do it with something historical. Put them there when the Berlin Wall's falling down, or put them on the deck of the Titanic. Whatever you fancy, your character is going to tell you how they would react to that situation. They're going to tell you what they would do. They're going to tell you how they would feel. And that's your story. And the exciting thing about this when you're rewriting myths is you can take one myth, one story, and you can tell it from 50 different perspectives. So I'm going to pick a fairy tale because I love fairy tales. They're my favourite probably to work with. Little Red Riding Hood. You can tell it from the granny's perspective. You can tell it from Little Red Riding Hood's perspective. You can tell it from the wolf's perspective. You can tell it from the perspective of the forest if you want to be very avant-garde and weird. Whatever you fancy. And it becomes all sorts of different stories. I get really excited about that, as you can probably tell. You've reworked a myth at that point. So get your story that you want to play around with. Jot down a little bit of the basic structure of what happens in that story, whether you're talking about Cuchulainn or you're talking about the sirens in Greek mythology, or you're talking about the children of Israel going off to walk around the wilderness in the Bible. Whatever it is, pick your character, get to know them, put them in the story, and let them tell it from their perspective. I'm going to give you a practical example of this and walk you through something that I did. I've always had a strange interest in flying children. I don't know where this came from, but I've always had it. This is a very important book to me. Borges. It's Borges' book of imaginary beings, and it's kind of like a dictionary of every weird creature in mythology and legend. Brilliant book, and there's lots of flying beings in there. When I get stuck for ideas, I sometimes just dip in, pick out an imaginary being and put them in a story. I'm particularly interested in field flying creatures. I don't know what that says about me. So fallen angels, Icarus, fairies that have gone bad. There's a fantastic Gabriel Garcia Marquez story that I absolutely love called The Old Man with Enormous Wings, about an angel whose wings have stopped working. And at first, the people who find him think it's miraculous, and then they realise that without wings, an elderly angel is just an old man that they have to look after. You can actually Google it and have a read of it for free if you're interested. When I came to write my last novel, the Fire Starters here, I invariably put a flying child in it. And I came up with this character of Ella Penny. She's a little girl, she has wings, she comes from a family of people who have a tradition of flying, lots of flying children in her background, and yet Ella can't actually fly. Her wings are just a kind of weird thing that she trails around behind her. And I guess for me, Ella came from a place of exploring these ideas around what we expect of our children. So, because she has wings, her parents expect her to fly, and they don't stop to consider that their child might not be the same as them. It's a very interesting kind of theme to explore in Northern Ireland. I think we've probably all experienced that ourselves. Um, so, I had this idea of Ella. And I based her on, I guess, a little bit myself, because most of my characters have an element of me in it, and some other people who I knew. I spent some time getting to know her. I asked her those questions. I knew that one of her biggest motivations was wanting to please her parents, but she also wanted, her hope was that they would see her for who she really was. And she actually has a fantastic gift. She's able to bring things back from the dead. She wanted them to be able to see that. I knew that she was most afraid of not fulfilling her actual potential, and that her wings were not an asset so much as a flaw. Um, I wanted to place her inside a story, so there actually was a physical piece of action that happened with Ella, and I had a thought about what would be the place of greatest interest, and that might be something you think about in your story. Where's the most action in the myth you're working with to place your character in? And I thought there'd be a lot of tension and excitement at the point where her parents are trying to coerce her into flying. So this is the part where Ella takes her first flight lesson, or one of her first flight lessons. I'm going to read you 2 pages of it. You can hear all of those themes coming out, but I hope you can also hear that all of those characteristics I told you about Ella, her fears, her hopes, her ambitions, they come across. She's still the same regardless of what situation she's placed in, and that's an important thing to remember with your characters. They will always defer to their driving characteristics. This is called The Girl Who Could Only Fall. Ella stands barefoot on the branch. She never wears shoes when she's attempting to fly. Her mother insists that she strip right down to her knickers. Now she's older and more self-conscious about the bumps and curves beginning to swell beneath her skin, Ella insists upon something more substantial, a bathing suit or leotard. Her mother agrees so long as her legs and arms are bare. It's important not to add any extra weight, to preserve the impression of lightness. Not that it really matters. Ella could bind herself up with birthday balloons, suck helium straight from the canister, or pump her arms up and down like a racing pigeon, and it wouldn't make the smallest bit of difference. She'd still fall, drop, plummet to earth at a furious rate. Ella wraps her arms around the trunk. She can feel its damp bark grating against her fingertips. Her skin, pressed against the tree's brown, is so white it's almost glowing. There's a purple-blue smudge on her left hip from last week's fall, a pair of pink grazes beginning to crust across her kneecaps. Last week it was a wall. Today it's a tree. They've tried step ladders, climbing frames, even a bridge. Seemingly there's no end to the high things you can push your daughter off for her own good. Ella looks down and notes the springy green grass circling the tree's trunk. She's grateful for it. There's more give in lawns. Concrete is not so forgiving. A starling rattled out of the tree's upper branches, goes sweeping past her face. Ella envies its easy flight. As she edges forward, she's careful to keep her elbows tucked in. She can't risk unfurling her wings. They're covered in a thin membrane, like skin but easier torn, and she must avoid loose splinters. She eases out towards the branch's tip, feeling it bow under her weight, curling her feet around its thin curve. Beneath her naked toes, the branch teems with tiny creatures, woodlice, ants, microscopic mini beasts. They're drawn to Ella and the power that leaks out of her every time she touches. She feels the tickle of them crushing against her skin. She could stay here for hours. She honestly could. But it's not what they want from her. It would be a waste of her wings. Ready? Shouts her father. Ready, Ella replies. 12 feet below, he removes the ladder and steps back for a better view. Her mother has the video camera out. Ella unfolds her arms, letting her wings unfurl like pink sails lolloping in the breeze. She bends her knees and pushes off. For the smallest second, she moves upward. It's only a second, but in this one small moment, Ella always believes. Then gravity grabs her by the ankles and drags her back to earth. She hits the ground rolling. She's taught herself how to lessen the impact. There's only so many times you can fall before you become an expert, and Ella is only good for falling. So I hope you could see there the kind of pattern of getting to know a character and putting them inside a situation and then letting them react to that, and they'll tell the story for you. In some ways, that is a kind of little 4-minute myth there. It's a retelling of the Icarus story of the, trying to fly and getting pulled back to Earth. Have fun with this, play around with it. It's not an exact science, but for me, if you spend proper time getting to know the character, the person who's going to tell your story, and you place them in a situation or a setting where you've got a little bit of an idea of what happens, they're going to react in a way that gives you the story on a plate. This is something that gets easier with practice, but why don't you have a go at it yourself? Pick a folk story, a myth, a fairy tale, and try telling it from an angle that hasn't been explored yet. I'm really looking forward to what you can come up with on this project. Thanks for spending some time with me, and I will see you again very soon.